As my wealthy in-laws laughed at my father's worn suit, I simply checked my watch. They saw a simple repairman, but they had no idea that at 8:15, the governor would walk through the front door with a full police escort. He was not coming for their donations, but to honor my dad. I took a slow sip of wine. They were laughing now, but they had laughed at the wrong man. My name is Liliana Wilkins, and I was currently sitting in a dining room that likely cost more than the entire accumulated lifetime earnings of the man sitting to my right. The air in the Whitfield residence was not merely air. It was a carefully curated atmosphere, scented with fresh pine, expensive beeswax candles, and the undeniable metallic tang of old money. We were seated at a mahogany table long enough to land a small aircraft on, surrounded by guests who wielded influence the way normal people wielded remote controls. To my left sat the district attorney. Across from me was a woman who owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Ridgemont. And at the head of the table sat my mother-in-law, Margaret Whitfield, the conductor of this symphony of pretension. Then there was my father, Calvin Ellison. He sat on my right, looking like a man trying desperately not to take up space. He was wearing his best suit, a charcoal gray number he had bought at a discount outlet 5 years ago for a funeral. It was clean, pressed within an inch of its life, but the cut was boxy and dated, the fabric clearly synthetic under the unforgiving glare of the crystal chandelier. He kept his hands folded on the table, rough hands with calluses that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. The hands of a man who had spent 40 years fixing cooling towers and industrial HVAC systems. I watched him reach for his water glass, hesitating because there were 3 different glasses in front of him and he was terrified of choosing the wrong one. That was when I heard it. Margaret leaned toward Mrs. Vance, the wife of a state senator. Her voice lowered to a pitch that was technically a whisper but acoustically designed to carry exactly as far as she intended. "It is a pity, really," Margaret said, covering her mouth with a manicured hand as she laughed lightly. "Liliana's father looks rather like the air conditioning repairman wandered into the wrong house and decided to stay for the prime rib." Mrs. Vance tittered, a sharp, bird-like sound. A few other guests who were close enough to hear chuckled along, the sound rippling through the quiet hum of polite conversation. I felt my blood turn to ice. I looked at my father. He had heard it. I knew he had heard it because his smile did not falter, but it became rigid, like a mask that had been pulled too tight. His hand, the one reaching for the water, froze for a millisecond before retreating to his lap. He gripped his linen napkin so hard his knuckles turned white, burying his shame under the table where no one could see. He simply stared straight ahead at the floral centerpiece, his eyes glassy, refusing to look at anyone for fear that eye contact would confirm he knew he was the punchline. My gaze snapped to my husband, Ethan Whitfield. Ethan was sitting 2 seats down. He had heard it too. I saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes darted nervously toward his mother and then down to his plate of roasted duck. He knew it was cruel. He knew it was unnecessary, but he did nothing. He took a sip of his wine, hiding behind the rim of the crystal glass, choosing the path of least resistance. That silence broke my heart more than Margaret's malice. Malice I expected from her. Cowardice from the man I loved was a different kind of wound. It was a silent confirmation that in this house, under these lights, I was alone. I took a slow breath, forcing my heart rate to steady. I glanced at the antique grandfather clock standing sentinel in the corner. It was 7:20 in the evening. 55 minutes. Just under 1 hour. My chest tightened, but not with fear. It was a strange, vibrating mixture of adrenaline and vindication. They thought they were looking at a retired blue-collar worker who did not know which fork to use for the salad. They thought they were superior in every conceivable metric. They had no idea that at 8:15 exactly, the mood in this room was going to shift so violently it would leave them breathless. They did not know that the police escort was already gathering at the edge of the subdivision. They did not know that the governor of the state, the man whose campaign Charles Whitfield had donated $50,000 to just to get a handshake, was not coming here to see them. I looked back at Margaret, who was now charming the senator with a story about their summer home in the Hamptons. She looked so secure in her power. She looked untouchable. I remembered the conversation we had 3 days ago in her kitchen. The marble countertops had been cold under my fingers as she poured herself a cup of herbal tea and delivered her ultimatum with a smile. "Liliana, dear," she had said, not bothering to look at me. "This Christmas is going to be quite significant. We have Senator Miller coming, and likely a few people from the governor's inner circle. It is about networking, you understand." "I understand," I had said, knowing exactly where this was going. "We need to maintain a certain image," she continued, finally turning her icy blue eyes on me. "Perhaps you could find an excuse for your father to stay home this year? Maybe tell him we have the flu? It would just save him the embarrassment. We do not want him to feel out of place. He does tend to drag down the tone of the evening." I had wanted to scream. I had wanted to tell her that my father had more dignity in his little finger than she had in her entire lineage, but I had swallowed it. I had swallowed it because I had already received the email from the governor's chief of staff. I had called my dad later that night, intending to maybe soften the blow, to warn him, but when he answered the phone, his voice was so full of genuine excitement it broke me. "Lily," he had said, "I got my suit from the cleaners. I even bought a new handkerchief. I can't wait to see this house. It sounds like something out of a Hollywood movie. Imagine, me, Calvin Ellison, having Christmas dinner in a mansion." He was so proud, not of being near money, but of being included, of being part of my life. "I can't wait to see you, Dad," I had told him, my voice trembling. "And Dad, you are going to be the most important person there." "Oh, stop it," he had laughed. "I'll just try not to spill the gravy." Back in the dining room, the memory of his laugh fueled a cold fire in my stomach. I looked down at my phone, which I had placed face down on the tablecloth next to my silverware. It buzzed once, a short, sharp vibration against the wood. I slid it open under the table, shielding the screen. It was a text from the governor's personal aide. "Motorcade is passing the highway exit. ETA is 20 minutes. Confirmation. Arrival at 8:15. Do not warn the hosts. Governor Hart wants to see the look on your father's face personally." I slipped the phone back into my clutch. 20 minutes. I picked up my wine glass again. The liquid was dark, rich, and tasted like vengeance. "So, Calvin," a man across the table asked, a wealthy developer named Mr. Sterling. His tone was jovial but condescending, the way one speaks to a child. "Margaret tells us you used to work in repairs. Must be nice to be retired. Do you miss crawling into those crawl spaces?" The table quieted. They were waiting for the simple man to say something simple. My dad cleared his throat. He looked nervous. He touched his tie, checking for the 10th time that it was straight. "Well, sir, I was a technical lead for industrial refrigeration. It was hard work, but honest. I miss the guys. I don't miss the cold." "Industrial refrigeration," Margaret repeated, emphasizing the words as if they were distasteful. "How fascinating. Well, at least if the ice maker breaks tonight, we know who to call." Laughter again, this time louder. I saw Dad's shoulders slump a fraction of an inch. He forced a chuckle, trying to be a good sport, trying not to ruin his daughter's fancy dinner. He looked so small in that moment, surrounded by people who measured worth in stock options and club memberships. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the burn scar on his forearm from the time he saved a rookie technician from a steam pipe burst. I saw the lines around his eyes from years of squinting at blueprints in dim light. I saw the man who had raised me on a single income, who had heated up soup for me when Mom left, who had taught me that integrity was doing the right thing when no one was watching. They thought he was nobody, a prop, a joke. I took a slow sip of wine, letting the silence stretch out, savoring the anticipation. "Laugh while you can. Margaret," I thought, "enjoy your moment. Ethan, keep looking down at your plate." Because at 8:15, the world was going to turn upside down. They thought the governor was their friend. They thought power recognized power. but they were about to learn a lesson that money could not buy. They were about to learn that the man they were mocking was the only reason the man they worshipped still had a career. I glanced at my dad one last time. He was fussing with his tie again, unaware that in less than half an hour, that old, slightly frayed piece of silk would be on the front page of every newspaper in the state. "Is everything all right, Liliana?" Margaret asked, noticing my stare. "You seem distracted. I hope the wine is to your liking. It is $2,000 a bottle." I smiled at her. It was the sharpest, coldest smile I had ever worn. "The wine is delicious, Margaret," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I am just looking forward to dessert. I have a feeling it is going to be incredibly satisfying tonight." "Oh, we are having crème brûlée," she dismissed me, turning back to the senator. "I know," I whispered to myself as I checked my watch again. "We are having just desserts." 8 o'clock. 15 minutes. The show was about to begin. To understand why the silence at the Whitfield dinner table felt so loud to me, you have to understand the noise of Harbor Glen. I did not grow up with crystal stemware or beeswax candles. I grew up with the rhythmic thrum of the stamping plants and the chemical tang of the river that cut through our town like a bruised vein. Harbor Glen was one of those industrial towns that people drove through with their windows rolled up, a place of gray skies and rusting chain-link fences, where the economy had been on a slow, agonizing slide since the late 90s. My father, Calvin, was a fixture in that town. He was the man you called when the walk-in freezer at the grocery store died in July, or when the ancient boiler in the elementary school gave up the ghost in January. He was a wizard with a wrench and a multimeter, a technical lead for the largest chemical processing plant in the district. But to me, he was just Dad, the giant in the blue coveralls who smelled permanently of Freon and fast orange hand cleaner. My mother left when I was 10 years old. She did not die. She just decided that the gray skies of Harbor Glen were suffocating her. So she packed a single suitcase and got into a car with a man who sold insurance. She never looked back. That left just the two of us. Calvin Ellison took on the role of both mother and father with a quiet, desperate determination. He tried to make our small, drafty rental house feel like a fortress against the world. He was terrified that I would feel the lack, that I would notice the empty chair at the table or the silence in the evenings. So he filled the space. He filled it with bad jokes, with help on my math homework, and with a stubborn refusal to let me see him sweat. But I saw it. Children are like emotional seismographs. We pick up on tremors that adults think they are hiding. I knew when the rent was late because he would stop eating dinner, claiming he had a big lunch at the plant. I knew when the electricity bill was overdue because we would have candlelight adventure nights instead of watching television. I remember one Christmas in particular. I was 12. The winter that year was brutal, a wet, bone-chilling cold that seeped through the thin walls of our duplex. We did not have money for a tree. The plant had cut overtime hours, and Dad had spent the last of his savings fixing the transmission on his truck so he could get to work. I came home from school to find him in the living room, wrestling with a tangle of ancient Christmas lights he had salvaged from a dumpster behind a hardware store. Half the bulbs were missing, and the wire was frayed. "Close your eyes, Lilybug," he told me. I did. I heard the click of a switch, and then a soft hum. "Okay, open them." He had strung the lights around the window frame. Only every third bulb worked, casting a dim red and green glow against the peeling paint on the coffee table. He had placed 2 chipped mugs of hot cocoa, made with water instead of milk because milk was expensive. "It is not the Rockefeller Center," he said, rubbing his hands together, looking at me with anxious eyes, waiting for disappointment. I took a sip of the watery cocoa. It tasted like heaven. "It is perfect, Dad." He pulled me into a hug, his flannel shirt rough against my cheek. "We do not need a big house, Liliana," he whispered into my hair. "We just need to not let each other get cold. As long as we are warm, we are rich." That phrase branded itself onto my soul. As I entered high school, the gap between my world and the world outside widened. I was smart, book smart. I devoured everything from calculus to political science, earning grades that put me on the honor roll every semester. But academic success could not hide the fact that my jeans were 2 inches too short, or that my sneakers were held together with shoe glue. While other kids got new cars for their 16th birthdays, I walked to the bus stop, but on days when it rained, or when I stayed late for the debate club, Dad would pick me up. He drove a Ford F-150 that was older than I was. The paint was peeling, revealing the primer like a sunburn, and the engine sounded like a bag of hammers in a dryer, but the inside was spotless. He wiped down the dashboard every single morning. He vacuumed the mats. He treated that rust bucket with the same respect a diplomat treats a limousine because it was the vessel that carried his daughter. I remember walking out of the school gates one afternoon in my junior year. A group of boys from the wealthy subdivision on the hill, the kind of boys who wore boat shoes and pastel polo shirts, were leaning against a gleaming new Jeep. "Hey, Liliana," one of them shouted, pointing at the curb. "Is that the garbage truck coming to pick up the trash, or is that your ride?" The group erupted in laughter. My face burned. I looked at the truck idling at the curb. Dad was standing outside of it, leaning against the doorframe. He was wearing his work uniform, his name tag catching the sunlight. He saw the boys. He saw them pointing. He saw me freezing on the sidewalk. He did not get angry. He did not look ashamed. He just smiled. A big, genuine, sun-breaking-through-clouds smile, and waved at me. "Hey, sweetie," he called out, ignoring the boys entirely. "I got the heater working." One of the girls next to me, a friend I thought I could trust, nudged my arm. "God, Liliana, are you not embarrassed? Look at him." I looked at him. I saw the grease under his fingernails that came from fixing other people's problems. I saw the stoop in his shoulders from carrying the weight of 2 parents for a decade. I turned to the girl. "No," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I am not embarrassed. That is the only man in the world who has never left me." I walked to the truck, climbed in, and kissed him on the cheek. We drove away with our heads high, leaving the laughter in the rearview mirror. But the defining moment of my father's life, and the secret that was currently ticking like a time bomb in the Whitfield dining room, happened 2 years later. I was in my first year of college on a full scholarship, back home for the summer, the chemical plant where Dad worked, passing owners from one hedge fund to another, had started cutting corners on maintenance to boost quarterly profits. It started with a smell, a faint, sickly sweet odor of almonds drifting over the playground of the elementary school 3 blocks downwind from the plant. Then came the headaches. Kids started going home with nosebleeds. The elderly in the neighborhood developed mysterious coughs that would not go away. Dad knew the systems. He knew the piping architecture better than the engineers who sat in the air-conditioned offices. He ran his own tests during a night shift. He found that a critical containment valve on the waistline was corroded, leaking toxic runoff directly into the groundwater table that fed the local wells. He followed protocol. He wrote a report. He took it to the plant manager. I remember him coming home that night, his face gray. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched dinner. "They told me to shred it," he said, his voice hollow. "They said it is just a sensor error. They said if I talk about this to anyone outside, I will lose my pension. I will be blacklisted." We needed that job. We had 0 savings. If he lost his job, we would lose the rental house within a month. "What are you going to do?" I asked, terrified. He looked at me, and I saw the same look he had given me when he fixed the Christmas lights. It was a look of quiet, terrified resolve. There are kids in that school. Lily, little kids. For the next 2 weeks, my father became a spy in his own life. He stayed late every night. He copied logbooks by hand because he was afraid to use the photocopier. He stole blueprints. He recorded pressure readings. He mapped out the entire drainage system, marking the leak points with red ink. He did not go to the newspapers. He knew the company owned the local paper. Instead, he drove 3 hours to the state capitol on a Tuesday, calling in sick. He had an appointment with a junior prosecutor in the Attorney General's office. a young firebrand named Lucas Hart, who was making a name for himself going after corporate negligence. I never saw the meeting, but Dad told me about it later. He said he walked into the office, placed a thick stack of papers on the desk, and said, "I am a nobody, but these papers say you are poisoning a town. I can tell you how to fix it, and I can prove they knew." The young Lucas Hart had looked at the documents, then at my father's trembling hands, and made a promise. "I will handle this, and I will keep your name out of it. They will never know it was you." When the story broke, it was a thunderclap. The raid on the plant was led by state troopers. The fines were in the millions. The entire neighborhood was evacuated and relocated to temporary housing while the EPA cleaned the site. Free medical screenings were established for every resident of Harbor Glen. It was the biggest victory of Lucas Hart's career. He was on the evening news every night, looking sharp and heroic, the champion of the working class. But back in Harbor Glen, the hero was invisible. Dad kept his job, barely. The company suspected a leak, but they could never prove it was him. However, they punished him in other ways. His hours were cut to the legal minimum. He was moved from the technical lead position to general maintenance, sweeping floors and changing light bulbs, a humiliation designed to make him quit. We were broke. We ate rice and beans for 6 months. I had to take a second job at the university library to cover my textbooks. One night, watching Lucas Hart accept an award on television, I felt a surge of bitterness. "It is not fair," I said, slamming my book shut. "He is getting famous, and you are getting your hours cut. You saved those people. Dad, you should tell everyone." Dad was oiling his work boots by the door. He paused and looked up at the screen, where the future governor was shaking hands with the press. "No, Lily," he said softly, "I did the right thing. That is the payment. It does not matter who gets the credit. It matters that the kids aren't getting sick anymore." He looked back down at his boots, scrubbing away a spot of grime. A man who needs an audience to do good is not a good man. He is just an actor. I was 19 then. I was too young and too angry to fully grasp the magnitude of his integrity. I just saw my father, tired, poor, and overlooked, paying the price for a heroism that no one knew existed. But I never forgot it, and as I sat in the Whitfield mansion, listening to the clink of silver against china, I realized that my father had been right. He was not an actor. But tonight, whether he wanted it or not, the audience was finally coming to him. After graduating, I left the gray skies of Harbor Glen for the polished concrete of Ridgemont, the state capital. I landed a job as a junior data analyst at Civic Path Strategies, a boutique consultancy firm that advised on public policy. It was a world of crisp blazers, espresso machines that cost more than my first car, and conversations that revolved around polling numbers and fiscal quarters. It was there, in the break room while waiting for the single origin roast to brew, that I met Ethan Whitfield. Ethan was everything I was not. He was effortless. He wore suits that draped perfectly over his shoulders, signaling tailored fittings rather than off-the-rack purchases. He was an associate at a prestigious law firm located in the penthouse of our building, and he had that specific kind of confidence that only comes from never having worried about a utility bill in your entire life. He was drawn to me because I was different. He told me he loved my sharpness, my ability to cut through the corporate fluff and see the raw data underneath. He called it refreshing, to him. I was a novelty, a woman who did not speak in the coded, passive-aggressive language of his social circle, and I, in my naivety, was drawn to his politeness. I mistook his smooth manners for kindness. I thought that because he opened doors for me and spoke in a soft, educated baritone, he was a gentleman. I thought he was the bridge between my two worlds. I was wrong. He was not a bridge. He was a tourist. The first time I brought Ethan home to Harbor Glen, I saw my life through his eyes, and the view made my stomach turn. I saw the peeling paint on the porch railing not as a sign of age, but as a sign of failure. I heard the neighbor's dog barking incessantly not as background noise, but as a nuisance. Dad had been cleaning the house for 3 days. He had bought a new tablecloth, a bright yellow plastic one that smelled faintly of vinyl. He had prepared his specialty, which was actually a family-sized frozen lasagna from the discount grocery store, baked until the cheese was bubbling and slightly burnt at the edges. "Welcome, welcome," Dad had boomed, wiping his hands on a rag before shaking Ethan's hand. Dad's grip was firm, his palms rough like sandpaper. Ethan's hand looked soft and manicured in comparison. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Ellison," Ethan said. His smile was perfect, practiced, and stopped entirely at his mouth. His eyes were darting around the living room, taking in the mismatched furniture and the stack of HVAC trade magazines on the coffee table. We sat down to dinner. Dad poured beer into the 3 matching glass tumblers he owned, the ones he usually saved for New Year's Eve. "It is not craft beer, I am afraid," Dad said apologetically. "Just good old domestic." "This is fine, really," Ethan said. He took a sip, and I watched his throat work as he swallowed. It was a small movement, but I saw the effort in it. He ate the lasagna with a fork and knife, cutting the sloppy squares into precise geometric shapes, complementing the texture while leaving half of it on his plate. He was polite. He was painfully, excruciatingly polite, but it was the politeness of a man visiting a petting zoo, careful not to get any dirt on his shoes. When we got engaged 6 months later, Dad cried. We were sitting on his porch, and he held my hand, his eyes shining with tears that caught the light of the street lamp. "I do not have much to give you, Lily," he choked out. "I know the father is supposed to pay for the wedding, but—" "Dad, stop," I said, squeezing his hand. "We are keeping it simple." No, he insisted. "I am going to help. I have a plan." The next weekend, I came home to find him on a ladder in the hallway. He had boxes of light bulbs stacked on the floor. "LEDs, he announced triumphantly. I did the math. "Lily, if I replace every incandescent bulb in the house with these high-efficiency ones, and I am strict about the thermostat, I can save about $40 a month on the electric bill over the next year. That is nearly $500. It is not much, but it will pay for your flowers." He looked so proud of his calculation. He had turned his poverty into an engineering problem to be solved for the sake of his daughter. I stood there, looking at the harsh, white light of the new bulb, and I felt a crack in my heart. $500 was what Ethan spent on a weekend golf trip. To my father, it was a year of darkness and discipline. "It is perfect, Dad," I said, forcing a smile because if I did not smile, I would have wept. Then came the day I entered the orbit of the Whitfields. Ethan drove me to Briarwood Hills in his Audi. As we passed through the wrought iron gates of the community, the world changed. The grass was greener, cut to a uniform height that seemed mathematically impossible. The houses were not homes. They were estates. When we pulled into the driveway of his parents' house, I stopped breathing for a second. It was a sprawling colonial mansion with white pillars that looked like they belonged on a government building. "Just be yourself," Ethan said, squeezing my knee. "They will love you." They did not love me. They examined me. The interior of the house was like a museum. It was cold, silent, and smelled of lemon polish and judgment. There was a Christmas tree in the foyer that was so tall it brushed the ceiling, decorated with glass ornaments that probably cost more than my dad's truck. Margaret Whitfield descended the staircase like royalty coming down to greet the peasants. She was wearing a cashmere sweater set in pearls. Her smile was tight, her eyes scanning me from my shoes, discount store, on sale, to my hair, styled by me. "So this is Liliana," she said, offering a cheek to be kissed but not hugging me. "Ethan has told us so much about your ambition." We moved to the dining room. Charles Whitfield, a man who looked like he was carved out of expensive ham, sat at the head of the table. He was a real estate developer who owned half the apartment complexes in the tri-state area. He barely spoke. He just nodded at me, took a sip of a red wine that was older than I was, and let his wife run the show. I realized then that Charles was not the power in the house. He was the bank. Margaret was the general. The interrogation began during the salad course. "So, Liliana," Margaret said, picking at a piece of arugula, "Ethan mentions your father still lives in Harbor Glen, is that right?" "Yes," I said, keeping my chin up. "He has lived there for 30 years. "And what is it that he does?" she asked. "Is he retired?" "He is an HVAC technician," I said. I refused to say repairman because I knew how she would hear it. "He is currently working freelance." Margaret paused. She looked at Ethan, then back at me. A small, amused smile played on her lips. "Oh," she said, "a technician. That is very practical. Well, I suppose that is good news for you and Ethan. At least you will never have to worry about the air conditioning breaking down in the summer." She laughed. It was a light, tinkling sound. Charles chuckled into his wine glass. Even Ethan let out a short, nervous laugh. I sat there, my hand trembling beneath the table. It was not a joke. It was a dismissal. In 2 sentences, she had reduced my father's life of hard labor and technical expertise into a convenient service for her comfort. She had turned him into the help. "He is very good at what he does," I said, my voice tight. "I am sure he is, dear," Margaret said, waving her hand dismissively. "Now, about the wedding venue, we simply must talk about the club." For the next hour, I watched my wedding being hijacked. Margaret did not ask. She suggested with the force of a command. "The Briarwood Country Club is really the only option," she said, cutting into her steak. "We have a reputation to uphold. You know, we cannot have it at some park." "And the guest list," she continued, pulling a piece of paper from her pocket. "We have about 200 guests from our side. Partners, clients, the senator. I assume your side will be smaller?" "My family is small, yes," I said. "Good," she said, nodding. "We want to keep the intimate feel, and honestly, it is better not to mix the groups too much. It can be awkward for people who are not used to formal events. We do not want your cousins feeling uncomfortable with the silverware, do we?" I looked at Ethan. I waited for him to say something. I waited for him to say, "Mom, that is offensive." I waited for him to defend the people I came from. He just looked at me with pleading eyes. "It makes sense, Liliana," he said softly. "It is just their culture. Mom just wants everything to be perfect." I looked at him, and I felt something wither inside me. He was not protecting me. He was managing me. He was asking me to erase the rough edges of my history so that I would fit into the smooth, polished puzzle of his life. "Fine," I said. "The country club?" Margaret beamed. "Wonderful. I knew you were a sensible girl." I finished the dinner, smiling when required, nodding when appropriate. But inside, I was taking notes. I was recording every slight, every condescending glance, every time they spoke about my father as if he were a distant, unfortunate relative who needed to be hidden away. They thought I was agreeing with them. They thought I was grateful to be lifted out of Harbor Glen and placed in their gilded cage. They were wrong. I was not grateful. I was angry. As we drove away that night, leaving the mansion behind, I looked out the window at the passing streetlights. I thought about my dad on his ladder, counting pennies from light bulbs to buy me flowers. I thought about Margaret's laugh when she talked about his job. I realized then that to the Whitfields, my father was just a detail, an awkward, blue-collar smudge on their pristine canvas. They wanted to crop him out of the picture. But I was the daughter of a man who found leaks that no one else could see. I knew how to wait. I knew how to gather evidence, and I promised myself, right then and there in the passenger seat of that luxury car, that one day I would force them to look at the smudge until it was the only thing they could see. The discovery did not happen with a bang. It happened with the quiet click of a mouse in a sterile, fluorescent-lit office on a Tuesday afternoon. I was 3 months into a new project at Civic Path Strategies. My task was dry and tedious. I was compiling a retrospective analysis on state-level environmental regulations over the last 20 years, looking for patterns in how industrial fines were levied and collected. It meant wading through thousands of pages of scanned court documents, EPA filings, and redacted witness testimonies. I was on my third cup of coffee, scrolling through a PDF file named State vs. Oak Haven Chemical Processing, case number 492, when the name of the location made me freeze. Harbor Glen. My heart did a strange little stutter step. I leaned in closer to the monitor. This was the case. This was the lawsuit that had rocked my hometown when I was a teenager. The lawsuit that had saved the neighborhood and cost my father his reputation within the company. I started reading, no longer skimming for data points but devouring the text. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on a set of internal documents provided by a confidential source A. The file contained scanned images of hand-drawn schematics. They showed the pressure valves of the cooling system, the illegal bypass piping, and a handwritten log of chemical discharge dates. I stopped breathing. I knew that handwriting. I knew the specific way the letter R curled at the end. I knew the way the arrows on the flowchart were drawn with ruler-straight precision. I had seen those exact drawings on our kitchen table, sketched on the back of utility bills or on napkins, while my father muttered about flow rates and pounds per square inch. I was looking at my father's mind, preserved in legal amber. I scrolled down to the legal team. The lead prosecutor for the state was listed in bold type. Lucas Hart, Assistant District Attorney. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, the hum of the office fading away. Lucas Hart, the man who was now the governor of our state, the man whose portrait hung in the lobby of the Whitfields Country Club, the man Ethan's father, Charles, claimed to be close personal friends with, despite having only met him once at a fundraising gala where Charles had paid $5,000 for a plate of rubbery chicken. I needed to be sure. 2 days later, I was attending a policy summit at the convention center downtown. Civic Path had a booth there, and I was manning it, handing out brochures nobody wanted. Across the hall, the governor's team was holding a breakout session on integrity and governance. I slipped into the back of the room. Governor Hart was not there, but his senior policy advisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Elena Rostova, was speaking. During the Q&A session, a journalism student asked about the governor's early career. Governor Hart built his reputation as a corruption buster, the student said. What was the turning point? Elena smiled. It was a practiced, political smile, but there was genuine respect in her voice. The Oak Haven case, she said immediately. That was the crucible. The governor often says that he was ready to quit the DA's office before that case. The system felt too rigged. But then an anonymous whistleblower came forward, a simple technician. He risked his livelihood to give Hart the evidence he needed. That man restored the governor's faith in public service. If not for that technician, Lucas Hart might be a corporate lawyer today, not your governor. The room applauded. I stood there, gripping my notebook, feeling a wave of heat travel up my neck. They were clapping for my father, and they did not even know he existed. I drove to Harbor Glen that weekend. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The siding a little more faded. Dad was in the garage, tinkering with a broken toaster he had rescued from a neighbor's trash. "Hi, Dad," I said, leaning against the workbench. "Lily," he put down his screwdriver. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Everything okay with Ethan?" "Ethan is fine," I said. I pulled my phone out and opened the photo I had taken of the court document. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." I showed him the schematic on the screen. He squinted, adjusting his reading glasses. For a moment, he was silent. Then he sighed, a long, heavy exhale that seemed to deflate him. "Where did you get this?" "Work," I said. "Dad, this is the case that made Lucas Hart famous. Did you know that?" He shrugged, picking up a rag to wipe his hands. "I saw him on TV. He did good work." "He made a career out of your work," I pressed. Did he ever contact you after?" Dad looked at the toaster. He was a busy man, Lily. He was going places. "Dad." He looked up at me. He wrote me a letter, about a year after the trial. It was sent to a P.O. box so it wouldn't be traced to the house. "What did it say?" "He thanked me," Dad said softly. "He said that I taught him what bravery looked like, And he wrote. He wrote that if I ever needed anything, anything at all, for me or my family, I just had to ask. He called it a life debt. And you never asked? Dad laughed, a self-deprecating sound. Asked for what? A handout? I have my job. I have my house. I have you. I did not do it for a favor. Lily. I looked at him, this proud, stubborn, honorable man who was currently wearing a shirt with a small hole in the collar, and I felt a fierce, protective rage. He was content to be invisible, but the world, specifically the world I was marrying into, punished invisible people. I went back to my apartment that night. Ethan was out at a dinner with partners from his firm, schmoozing his way up the ladder. I sat at my laptop and opened a blank email. I did not use my work email. I used my personal one. I searched for the public contact information for the governor's office. I found the general inquiry address, which I knew was monitored by interns, but I also used my skills to find the direct email format for the executive staff. Subject: The Oak Haven Whistleblower. Confidential source A. I began typing. I did not beg. I did not ask for money. I simply laid out the facts. Dear Governor Hart, 20 years ago, a technician provided you with the flowcharts and pressure logs that allowed you to prosecute the Oak Haven case. He did so at great personal risk. You told him that if he ever needed help, he should ask. My name is Liliana Wilkins. I am his daughter. He would never write this email, because he believes doing the right thing is its own reward. But I have the original notebooks from 1998. I have the graphite sketches that match your court exhibits, file 492. He is an old man now. He has been forgotten by the state he helped save. I am writing simply to ask if you remember him. I attached photos of the yellowed notebook pages, placing them side by side with the court documents. I hit send at 11:30 at night. I expected a generic auto-reply. I expected silence for weeks. At 7:15 the next morning, my phone rang. It was a block number. This is Sarah Jenkins, Chief of Staff for Governor Hart, a crisp, professional voice said. Am I speaking with Liliana Wilkins? I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Yes, this is she. I have the governor here, she said. Please hold. There was a click, and then a deep, familiar voice. The voice I heard on the news. The voice that gave the state of the state address. Came on the line, but it sounded different, less projected, more human. Ms. Wilkins, Governor Hart said. I was up until 2 in the morning looking at those attachments. Your father is Calvin Ellison, is that right? Yes, Governor. Calvin, he repeated, the name sounding heavy with nostalgia. I haven't heard that name in 2 decades, but I have never forgotten the man. Is he okay? Is he in trouble? He is fine, sir, I said. He is just Calvin. I meant what I said in that letter, Hart said firmly. I owe him, my entire platform, everything I have built, stands on the foundation he poured. I want to see him. I want to shake his hand properly. I want to do something for him. He wouldn't want a parade. Governor, I said. He is very shy. Then a private meeting, Hart suggested, or a dinner, anything. My initial instinct was to agree to a quiet coffee, maybe a handshake in the governor's office. It would be a nice memory for Dad, something to frame on the wall. But then, I heard the front door open. Ethan had come home to change clothes before heading to the gym. I heard him on the phone with his mother. Yes, Mom, Ethan was saying, his voice echoing in the hallway. I know. We will try to keep him in the background. I will tell Liliana to buy him a new suit, so he doesn't look like a hobo. Yeah, I know the senator is coming. We won't let him embarrass us. He laughed, a short conspiratorial laugh. I lowered the phone from my ear for a second, staring at the bedroom door. The heat in my chest wasn't just anger anymore. It was clarity. They wanted to hide him. They wanted to erase him because he didn't fit their aesthetic. They treated him like a stain on their perfect white tablecloth. I put the phone back to my ear. Governor, I said, my voice steady and cool. Actually, there is something you could do. It is a bit unconventional. Name it, Hart said. My in-laws are hosting a Christmas Eve dinner, I said. They are very status-conscious people. They have invited Senator Miller. They think they are the most important people in the room. They treat my father like he is nothing. There was a pause on the line. Then I heard a low chuckle from the governor. I think I see where you are going with this, Liliana, he said. I don't want a private meeting, I said. I want you to walk into that dinner. I want you to look past the millionaires and the senator. I want you to walk right up to the repairman they are mocking. And I want you to tell them exactly who he is. A surprise inspection, Hart said, the amusement evident in his voice. I used to love those when I was a prosecutor. Can you do it? I asked. It would mean arriving on Christmas Eve. For Calvin Ellison, Hart said, I will bring the whole motorcade. Let's remind these people who the real VIPs are. I hung up the phone. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer electric thrill of the weapon I had just armed. I walked out into the hallway. Ethan was tying his expensive running shoes. Morning, babe, he said, not looking up. Mom is really stressing about the guest list. Make sure you talk to your dad about table manners, okay? No slurping the soup. I looked at him. I looked at the man I had promised to love, and I saw how small he really was. Don't worry, Ethan, I said, smiling a smile that didn't reach my eyes. I think Dad is going to make quite an impression this year. Good, he said, oblivious. That is all we ask. I turned away, hiding the fierce satisfaction burning in my chest. Oh, you have no idea what you just asked for. The notification arrived on my phone with a cheerful ding that belied the toxicity of its contents. It was Tuesday morning, 3 days before Christmas, and the sender was Margaret Whitfield. The subject line read, Christmas Dinner Logistics, a Small Thought. I sat at my kitchen island, a mug of coffee growing cold in my hand, and opened the message. Dearest Liliana, I am finalizing the seating chart for Christmas Eve. We are so thrilled to have the senator joining us, along with the CEO of Venture One. It is going to be a rather high-stakes evening for Charles. Lots of shop talk and policy discussion. I was thinking about your father. You know how overwhelmed he looked at the engagement party? I would hate for him to feel out of place or uncomfortable among people he, has nothing in common with. Perhaps he would prefer a quiet, relaxing Christmas at his own home. We could send over a catered basket. It might be kinder to him than forcing him to sit through 3 hours of tax law conversation. Let me know what you think. It is just a suggestion for his comfort. Love. Margaret. I read the email twice. The first time, I felt a physical blow to my chest. The second time, the blow turned into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. It was a masterclass in passive aggression. She had framed my father's exclusion as an act of mercy, disguising her embarrassment of him as concern for his well-being. Ethan walked into the kitchen, adjusting his tie. He looked handsome, successful, and completely oblivious to the war that had just been declared in my inbox. Coffee ready? He asked, reaching for the pot. Read this, I said, sliding my phone across the granite counter. Ethan picked it up. Scrolling through the text, I watched his face. I waited for the frown, the indignation, the moment he would say, "This is ridiculous. I will call her right now." Instead, he sighed. He put the phone down and rubbed the back of his neck. "She has a point, Liliana," he said softly. The silence that followed was deafening. "A point?" I repeated, my voice dangerously low. "Her point is that my father is not good enough to sit at her table." "No, that is not it," Ethan said, pouring milk into his coffee, avoiding my eyes. "Look, Senator Miller is going to be there. It is going to be intense. Dad is trying to close a massive zoning deal. Mom just thinks your dad might be bored. You know he doesn't care about politics or real estate. She is just trying to save him from an awkward evening." "She is trying to hide him," I said, standing up. "She is treating him like a dirty secret, and you are agreeing with her." "I am not agreeing with her," Ethan snapped, his patience fraying. "I am just saying that maybe it would be easier For everyone, including him. Easier for you, I corrected, because you are ashamed of him. I am not ashamed. Ethan slammed his mug down. I just want one holiday where I do not have to worry about whether someone is using the wrong fork or talking about fixing a compressor while the senator is talking about fiscal policy. Is that a crime? I looked at my husband. For the first time, I saw him clearly. He wasn't a bad man, perhaps, but he was a weak one. He had spent his entire life in the Whitfield bubble, and he was terrified of anything that might pop it. Go to work, Ethan, I said, turning my back on him. I will handle the RSVP. Later that afternoon, I drove to Harbor Glen. I needed to see Dad. I needed to ground myself before I made the decision that would burn bridges I could never rebuild. I found him on the roof of his house, restringing a plastic Santa Claus that had blown over in the wind. He climbed down the ladder when he saw my car, wiping his hands on his jeans. Hey, kiddo, he smiled. Just getting St. Nick ready for the big night. We sat in his kitchen. I made tea. I tried to find the words to tell him about the dinner without breaking his heart, but Dad, with his simple, quiet wisdom, beat me to it. You look stressed, Lily, he said, blowing on his tea. Is it the in-laws? I hesitated. Margaret, she is just worried about the guest list. There are going to be some bigwigs there. It might be a bit stiff. Dad nodded slowly. He looked down at his calloused hands. You know, he said, his voice gentle. I don't have to go. Lily, I have plenty of projects here. I can get a pizza, watch the football game. I don't want to make things hard for you. He offered me an out. He was willing to spend Christmas alone, eating a Domino's pizza in an empty house, just so his daughter wouldn't be embarrassed by him. I looked at the lines on his face. I thought about the chemical plant. I thought about the years he spent raising me alone. I thought about the LED lights he installed to pay for my flowers. No, I said fiercely. You are coming, and you are going to sit right next to me. Lily. No arguments. Dad, if you are not welcome there, then I am not going either. And if I don't go, Ethan spends Christmas explaining to his mother why her daughter-in-law walked out. Dad smiled, a little sad but grateful. Okay, I'll polish my shoes. The next day, I had a meeting that was not on my official calendar at Civic Path. I met Sarah Jenkins, the governor's chief of staff, at a small diner on the outskirts of Ridgemont. It was neutral ground. Sarah was a woman who radiated competence. She wore a blazer that looked like armor and typed on 2 phones simultaneously. When I sat down, she put them both away and gave me her full attention. The governor is committed, Sarah said without preamble. He has cleared his schedule for Christmas Eve from 7 to 9. The First Lady is not thrilled, but when he told her the story, she packed him a go-bag. I need to ask you something. Sarah, I said, leaning over the table. My in-laws, they are not kind people. They have spent the last week trying to uninvite my father. They think he is beneath them. Sarah raised an eyebrow. I did a background check on Charles Whitfield. He made his money in commercial strip malls. He is hardly royalty. They treat him like a prop, I continued. If the governor comes, it is going to cause a scene, a big one. The media will be there. My mother-in-law will try to spin it. I need to know if the governor is okay with walking into a hostile environment. Sarah stirred her coffee, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. Liliana, Lucas Hart made his career prosecuting corporate bullies. He eats people like the Whitfields for breakfast. In fact, when I told him about the situation, about the way they treat your father, he changed the plan. Changed how? He doesn't want a private room, Sarah said. He wants to do the presentation in front of everyone. He wants the senator to see it. He wants the business partners to see it. He said, and I quote, "If they want to judge a man by his status, let's give him some status." I felt a shiver run down my spine. So we are doing this? For real? We are doing this, Sarah confirmed. But we need absolute secrecy. If Margaret Whitfield gets wind of this, she will try to curate it. She will try to take credit. We need the element of surprise. The shock is part of the punishment. She won't know, I promised. I haven't even told Ethan. Sarah slid a folder across the table. Here is the timeline. The motorcade arrives at 8:15. We have notified the local precinct for traffic control, but we told them it is a security drill until 10 minutes out. You just make sure your dad is in the room. I left the diner feeling like I was carrying a grenade in my purse. The final insult came 2 days later. Margaret called me while I was at the mall. "Liliana, darling," she breezed. "I am so glad your father decided to come. It will be quaint now about his attire. I know he has that gray suit, but it is a bit dated, isn't it? The lapels are very 1990. It is a perfectly fine suit, Margaret," I said, grinding my teeth. Of course, she soothed. "But with the senator there, we want everyone to look cohesive. I have taken the liberty of emailing you a link to a rental shop. They have very affordable tuxedos, or at least a modern cut suit. Maybe you could take him? My treat, of course." She wanted me to rent a costume for my father. She wanted to dress him up like a doll so he wouldn't ruin her aesthetic. "I will handle his clothes, Margaret," I said, and hung up before I screamed. I did not go to the rental shop. Instead, I went to the men's department at Neiman Marcus. I had my end-of-year bonus check in my account, $3,000 I had planned to save for a new car. I spent nearly half of it in an hour. I bought a midnight blue wool suit, Italian cut. That felt like silk to the touch. I bought a crisp white shirt with mother-of-pearl buttons. I bought black leather Oxfords that shone like mirrors. I drove to Dad's house and laid them out on his bed. "Lily," he gasped, touching the fabric. "This is too much. I can't wear this. It costs more than my first truck." "You earned it, Dad," I said. "You earned it 20 years ago. Now put it on. We need to tailor the hem." He put the suit on. He stood in front of his cracked hallway mirror and straightened his spine. The transformation was startling. He didn't look like a repairman. He looked like a statesman. He looked distinguished, capable, and strong. "Now for the tie," I said, holding out a silk tie I had bought to match the suit. Dad shook his head. He reached into his drawer and pulled out his old tie, a simple red one with thin navy stripes. It was frayed at the bottom edge. It was the tie he had worn to my high school graduation. It was the tie he had worn to his interview at the plant 30 years ago. "I am wearing this one," he said firmly. "Dad, it is fraying," I said gently. "I know," he said, "but it is mine. I am not going there pretending to be a banker. Lily, I am Calvin Ellison. If this suit is the armor, this tie is the heart. I am not changing who I am just because the plates are expensive." I looked at him, tears stinging my eyes. "Okay," I whispered. "Wear the tie." On the morning of Christmas Eve, my phone buzzed with a final email from Office of the Governor. Official correspondence. Priority. Hi to Liliana Wilkins. Operational update. Target arrival. 8:15 p.m. Asset. Governor Lucas Hart plus media pool. Status. Confirmed. Note. Do not alert the host. Surprise is critical for impact. I deleted the email immediately. I put on my dress, a sharp, crimson number that felt like war paint. I applied my lipstick in the mirror, staring at my own reflection. I looked calm. I looked composed. Behind me, Ethan was struggling with his cufflinks. "You look intense," he commented. "Relax, babe. It is just dinner. Dad promised not to talk about the bond market until after appetizers." "I am relaxed," I lied. I walked over and fixed his cufflink. I patted his cheek. "I am just really looking forward to tonight. Ethan, I have a feeling it is going to be a Christmas we will remember for the rest of our lives." He smiled, relieved. "That is the spirit. Let's get through it, and tomorrow we can just chill." "Yes," I said, grabbing my clutch. "Let's get through it." We walked out to the car. The sky was dark, promising snow. The air was crisp and cold. Everything was silent, waiting. I checked my watch, 6:30. Less than 2 hours until the hurricane hit. The logistics of redemption are surprisingly similar to the logistics of a bank heist. You need a timeline, you need a diversion, and you need a team that knows exactly when to keep their mouths shut. 48 hours before the dinner, I was on a secure line with Sarah Jenkins, finalizing the choreography of the evening. We were treating this not as a social call, but as a tactical insertion. "We have contacted the Ridgemont Gazette and Channel 5 News," Sarah told me, her voice crisp and efficient. "The cover story is simple. We told them the governor is doing a holiday tour of key community pillars. We leaked that he would be stopping at the Whitfield residence to acknowledge their contributions to the state economy." I held the phone tight against my ear, pacing the length of my small home office. "And the Whitfields?" "They will believe it because they want to believe it," Sarah said, and I could hear the smirk in her voice. "Narcissism is the best camouflage. Liliana, Margaret Whitfield is already telling her bridge club that the governor is coming to consult Charles on economic policy. She is doing our work for us. She is ensuring the house is full of witnesses." "Perfect," I said. "But the police escort?" "Standard protocol for the governor," Sarah explained. "But we are adding 2 motorcycle units. We want it loud. We want the sirens to cut through the conversation. Governor Hart wants to make sure that when he walks in, nobody is looking at their salad." Then her tone shifted, becoming softer, more reverent. "Liliana, the governor reviewed the files you sent, the schematics, the pressure logs. He spent an hour just looking at the handwriting." I stopped pacing. "What did he say?" "He recognized it," she said. "He told me that he remembers sitting in a diner in 1998, looking at those exact arrows drawn in blue ink. He said he was ready to quit the law back then. He was tired of losing to big corporations. Then your dad gave him the map to the smoking gun. He said, 'My career did not start when I won the election. It started when Calvin Ellison handed me that notebook.'" My throat tightened. "He needs to say that," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Sarah, this cannot be vague. When he walks into that living room, I do not want a generic thank you. I want him to be specific. I want him to say that if it wasn't for my father, the scandal would have been buried. I want him to say that families were saved. And I want him to say it while looking Charles and Margaret in the eye." "He knows," Sarah assured me. "He is writing the speech himself. He is not bringing a speechwriter. He said this one comes from the gut." I hung up the phone, feeling a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. The trap was set. The bait was the Whitfield's own ego, and the steel jaws were currently sitting in the governor's mansion, waiting for the signal. The days leading up to Christmas Eve were a blur of nervous energy. I was constantly checking my phone, coordinating with Sarah, confirming the ETA, ensuring the media pool had the correct address. Ethan began to notice. On the morning of the 24th, he found me in the living room at 6 a.m, responding to an email from the governor's advance team regarding the driveway clearance. "Civic Path really doesn't understand the concept of a holiday, do they?" Ethan asked, leaning against the doorframe, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You have been glued to that screen for 3 days. Is there a crisis at the office?" I locked my phone screen instantly. "Just a big project wrapping up," I lied smoothly. "We are trying to push some policy recommendations through before the legislative session starts in January. It is time sensitive." Ethan walked over and kissed the top of my head. "Well, try to disconnect tonight, okay? Mom is already stressed enough about the senator. If you are checking emails at the table, she might actually have an aneurysm." "I promise," I said, looking up at him. "Tonight, my full attention will be on the room." He had no idea how true that statement was. The drive to Briarwood Hills that evening felt different than any other trip I had made to the mansion. Usually, the journey was filled with a sense of dread, a feeling that I was entering a fortress where I did not belong. Tonight, it felt like I was driving a Trojan horse. Dad sat in the passenger seat of my car. I had insisted on driving him myself. I did not want him arriving alone. He was wearing the midnight blue suit. It fit him perfectly, hugging his shoulders and giving him a silhouette of quiet dignity. But his hands were fidgeting in his lap, picking at the lint on his trousers. He was wearing his old red tie, the knot slightly askew. "I feel like I am in a costume, Lily," he muttered, looking out the window as the houses grew larger and the fences grew higher. "Do I really look okay? I don't want to look like I'm trying too hard." "You look handsome, Dad," I said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "You look like you own the place." "I don't want to own it," he said with a nervous chuckle. "I just want to get through the appetizers without Margaret asking me if I fixed the ice maker." "Let her ask," I said, my voice hardening. "Let her say whatever she wants. Just promise me you will hold your head up. You have nothing to be ashamed of." I know," he sighed. "It is just these people. Lily. They speak a different language. I always feel like I am taking up space I am not supposed to have." "That ends tonight," I whispered to myself. We pulled up to the iron gates of the Whitfield estate. The security guard checked my name on the list and waved us through. The driveway was already lined with luxury sedans, Mercedes, Lexus, a Bentley. I parked my sensible mid-sized sedan between a Porsche and a Range Rover. We walked to the front door. I could hear the hum of the party from outside. I fixed Dad's collar one last time. "Ready?" I asked. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "Ready as I'll ever be." The moment we stepped inside, the heat and the noise hit us. The house was magnificent. I had to give them that. The foyer was decked out in gold and silver garlands. A 12-foot fir tree dominated the space, dripping with crystal ornaments. Waiters in white tuxedo jackets circulated with trays of champagne. Margaret was in the center of the living room, holding court. She was wearing a red velvet gown that probably cost more than my college tuition. She was talking to a group of women, her hand gestures expansive and theatrical. "Well, naturally," I heard her say as we approached. "Charles has been advising the governor's office on infrastructure for months. When they called to say Hart wanted to stop by, we weren't surprised. It is a validation. Really. He knows who the real power players are in this district." I stopped walking. I felt Dad tense up beside me. Margaret turned and saw us. Her smile dimmed by about 30%, but she kept it fixed on her face. "Liliana," she called out, waving us over. "And, Calvin, you made it." Her eyes raked over Dad's new suit. I saw a flicker of surprise. She had expected the gray polyester. The Italian wool threw her off, but she recovered quickly. "Don't we look polished?" she said, her tone implying that a polished stone was still just a stone. "I see you took my advice about the rental. It fits quite well." I opened my mouth to correct her, to tell her I bought it, but I stopped. No, let her think what she wanted. It would make the fall harder. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield," Dad said politely. "You have a beautiful home." "Yes, we do," she agreed, turning back to her friends. "Ladies, this is Liliana's father. He works in maintenance, I believe. And Liliana, you must hear this. The governor is coming. Tonight. Can you imagine? He is bringing his whole security detail. It is going to be quite the spectacle for the neighborhood." One of the women, a brunette with diamonds the size of grapes in her ears, looked at Dad with mild curiosity. "The governor? How exciting. Do you follow politics, Mr. Ellison?" "I vote," Dad said simply. "How quaint," the woman said, turning back to Margaret. "Anyway, Margaret, tell us more about Charles's donation. Is it true he is being considered for a committee position?" They closed the circle. Dad and I were effectively dismissed. We were in the group, but we were not of the group. I led Dad toward the bar to get him a ginger ale. "See?" Dad whispered. "They think the governor is here for Charles. Maybe we should just stay in the kitchen when he comes. I don't want to be in the way." "You are not going to the kitchen," I said firmly. "You are staying right here." I looked around the room. Ethan was near the fireplace, laughing with the senator. Charles was showing off a box of cigars to a business rival. They were all so confident, so secure in their hierarchy. They believed the universe revolved around their bank accounts. My phone buzzed in my clutch. I pulled it out, It was a text from Sarah Jenkins. Eagle is 2 minutes out. Motorcade is turning onto Briarwood Lane. Get your father near the center of the room. And Liliana. I read the next line, and my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. When the governor walks in and asks for the name, do not just point. Sarah wants you to ensure the audio is clear. We are mic'd up for the press, but we want the room silent. I looked at the time, 8:13. Dad, I said, taking his glass of ginger ale and setting it on a coaster. Come with me. Where are we going? He asked. By the tree, I said. The light is better there. I positioned him near the entrance to the living room, right in front of the towering Christmas tree. It was the focal point of the house. Anyone entering from the foyer would have to look right at him. Lily, I feel exposed here, he whispered, tugging at his cuffs. Everyone is looking. Let them look, I said. A waiter approached Dad. May I take your coat, sir? Dad slipped off his heavy winter coat, handing it to the young man. Underneath, the midnight blue suit shimmered under the chandelier lights. He looked dignified. He looked honest. He looked like the only real thing in a room full of counterfeits. Suddenly, the chatter in the room died down. From outside the heavy oak front doors, a sound began to bleed through the insulation. It was a sound that did not belong in the quiet, private enclave of Briarwood Hills. Sirens. Not the distant wail of a passing ambulance, but the sharp, aggressive chirps of police escorts, the rumble of heavy engines, the screech of tires coming to a halt on the gravel driveway. Blue and red lights began to flash through the sheer curtains of the bay windows, painting the walls in strobing colors. He is here! Margaret shrieked, clapping her hands. Charles, get to the door! Everyone, places, the governor is here! The room scrambled. People smoothed their dresses, checked their ties, and formed a semicircle facing the entrance. Margaret positioned herself right in the center, beaming, ready to receive her prize. Charles stood next to her, puffing out his chest. Ethan hurried over to me. Liliana, move back a bit, he hissed, grabbing my elbow. You and your dad are blocking the view. The governor needs a clear path to Mom and Dad. I pulled my arm away from his grip. I planted my feet. No, Ethan, I said, my voice ice cold. We are exactly where we need to be. Liliana, don't be difficult, he snapped. This is important for my family. Yes, I said, looking him dead in the eye. It is. The heavy knocker on the front door slammed 3 times. The sound echoed through the silent room. I looked at Dad. He was staring at the door, confused, a little frightened by the commotion. He had no idea. He thought he was a spectator. I took a deep breath, the air in my lungs tasting like winter and victory. Open the door. Margaret, I thought, open the door and let the truth in. The transition from the foyer to the dining room felt like crossing a border between 2 hostile nations. The air in the room was heavy, scented with roasted duck and the overpowering perfume of expensive lilies. We took our seats. As per Margaret's meticulous design, I was placed between a tax attorney and the wife of a venture capitalist, while Dad was seated across from me, flanked by empty space on one side and the elbow of a man who clearly wished he was sitting anywhere else. The dinner began with a toast to prosperity, led by Charles. Everyone raised their crystal glasses. Dad raised his water glass, having politely declined the wine, a gesture that earned a microscopic sneer from the waiter. Margaret held court from the head of the table. She was in her element, conducting the conversation like an orchestra leader, ensuring that every topic showcased their status. She introduced the guests one by one, listing their accolades like menu items. To my right is Jonathan Sterling, who just closed the merger on the Skyline project, and across from him, Senator Miller, who we are so honored to have with us before he returns to D.C. The table murmured their appreciation. Applause was polite, restrained. Then, Margaret's eyes landed on my father. She paused, a theatrical beat of silence that drew everyone's attention to his off-the-rack haircut and his earnest, nervous smile. And this, Margaret announced, her voice pitching up an octave into a tone one might use for a slow child, is Liliana's father, Mr. Calvin Ellison. He is, well, he is the hero of broken air conditioners everywhere. If anyone finds the room a bit stuffy, or if your refrigerator stops making ice, Calvin is your man." A ripple of laughter went around the table. It was not warm laughter. It was the laughter of people who had never had to fix anything in their lives. Dad didn't flinch. He just smiled that gentle, self-effacing smile of his and nodded. "Just trying to keep people comfortable," he said softly. "It is honest work." "Oh, absolutely," Margaret said, dismissing him with a wave of her napkin. "So practical." I gripped the stem of my wine glass so hard I thought it might snap. I took a long sip, letting the liquid burn down my throat. "Keep laughing," I thought. "Get it all out of your system now." The first course arrived, a scallop carpaccio that looked like art and tasted like nothing. As the wine flowed, the volume in the room rose. Mr. Sterling, the merger specialist, had consumed 3 glasses of Pinot Noir rapidly and turned his glassy eyes toward my father. "Tss." "Gavin," Sterling slurred slightly. "You must rub elbows with all sorts in your line of work. You ever meet anyone important? Politicians? Captains of industry? In our circle. Knowing the governor is just a Tuesday, you know." Dad wiped his mouth carefully with his napkin. He looked thoughtful. "I have met a lot of people, sir. Teachers, nurses, factory workers. To me, they are all important. They keep the world running." Sterling blinked, confused by the lack of name-dropping. "I meant powerful people. Calvin, people who matter." Dad looked Sterling in the eye. "I only want to meet people who actually work for the public good. Mr. Sterling, the title doesn't impress me much. The character does." The table went silent. It was an awkward, heavy silence. Dad had unknowingly insulted half the room by implying that their power did not equate to character. Margaret let out a sharp, high-pitched laugh to break the tension. She leaned over and patted the senator's arm. "Oh, isn't that just adorable? Liliana's father always has these sweet, rustic ideals. It is so refreshing, like reading a storybook." She turned her gaze to me, her eyes glittering with malice. "But in the end," she continued, "we all know that ideals don't pay for private schools or summer homes, which is why it is such a blessing that Liliana married into this family, isn't it? She managed to elevate herself. It really is a Cinderella story, minus the pumpkin." The table chuckled again. This time, I saw Dad's jaw tighten. He wasn't hurt for himself. He was hurt for me. He hated hearing them talk as if I had been rescued from a burning building, rather than having built my own success. Ethan, sensing the danger in the air, cleared his throat. He looked panic-stricken, his eyes darting between me and his mother. "Well, speaking of the governor," Ethan said, trying desperately to pivot, "it is really amazing that he's stopping by tonight. I mean, Dad, your donation to the re-election campaign was significant. $50,000 is a serious commitment." I almost laughed out loud. 50,000. They thought they had bought the governor's presence for the price of a mid-range sedan. Margaret seized the lifeline. "Exactly. Ethan, Governor Hart knows who supports the backbone of this economy. When he comes through those doors tonight, he is coming to pay respects to the families that make this state prosperous. He is coming because we are his peers." She looked around the table, basking in the reflected glory of a man who hadn't even arrived yet. "He is a man of great discernment," Margaret added. "He doesn't waste his time on trivialities." I took another sip of wine. The irony was so rich it was almost choking me. Every word she spoke was adding another layer of dynamite to the explosion that was less than an hour away. "Actually," Dad spoke up again. His voice was quiet but steady. "I remember when the governor was just a prosecutor. There was a case at the chemical plant in Harbor Glen. I was working there at the time." Margaret rolled her eyes. She checked her diamond-encrusted watch. "I tried to do the right thing back then," Dad continued, looking at his hands. "It was scary. We had to document the leaks. I thought about the families living nearby. Oh, Calvin, please," Margaret interrupted, loud enough to silence him. "That is ancient history. Nobody wants to hear depressing stories about chemical leaks on Christmas Eve. We are trying to keep the mood festive." She turned her back on him completely, addressing the woman to her left. "Now, tell me about the yacht. Did you decide on the Mediterranean or the Caribbean for the spring?" Dad closed his mouth. He picked up his fork and pushed a scallop around his plate. He looked small. He looked defeated. I reached under the table and found his hand. I squeezed it hard. He looked at me, surprised, and I gave him a fierce look that said, "Wait, just wait." A woman across from me, the wife of the tax attorney, leaned in. She had been watching the exchange with a mixture of pity and curiosity. "Liliana," she asked, her voice lowered, "do you ever find it difficult, navigating these two worlds? I mean, do you ever feel embarrassed by your background when you are in circles like this?" The question hung in the air. The conversation nearby paused. Even Margaret stopped talking about yachts to hear my answer. They wanted me to admit it. They wanted me to say, "Yes, I am ashamed. Yes, I am lucky to be here." I set my glass down on the tablecloth. The crystal made a soft clink. I looked at the woman. I looked at Margaret. I looked at Ethan, who was staring at his plate like a coward. "Embarrassed?" I repeated the word, tasting it. I smiled. It was the smile of a predator who sees the trap about to snap shut. "Tonight," I said, my voice clear and projecting to the ends of the table, "you will all understand why that question is not for me to answer. I have never been more proud of where I come from than I am right now." Margaret scoffed. "Very cryptic, dear, but let's not get too dramatic." She stood up, tapping her spoon against her glass. The sharp ding-ding-ding silenced the room completely. "If I could have everyone's attention," Margaret announced, raising her glass high, "I would like to propose a toast to the Whitfield tradition, to success, to power, and to the company we keep. May we always be surrounded by those who understand the value of excellence." "Hear, hear," Charles mumbled. Margaret opened her mouth to continue, to deliver the climax of her self-congratulatory speech. Bong. The sound of the front doorbell rang out. It was not the polite chime of a guest. It was a long, authoritative ring, and beneath it, muffled by the heavy walls but unmistakable to everyone in the room, was the rhythmic, chopping whoop-whoop of a police siren winding down right outside the window. Margaret froze, her glass suspended in midair. I glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. The hands stood at exactly 8:15. "It appears," I said, not standing up, not raising my voice, "that the governor has arrived." The room held its breath. The curtain was up. The room was bathed in a sudden, violent wash of color. Through the large bay windows that overlooked the manicured lawn, the strobe lights of the police escort cut through the darkness. Blue and red flashes danced across the expensive cream-colored wallpaper, reflecting off the crystal wine glasses and making the diamonds in Mrs. Vance's ears spark with an aggressive, oscillating rhythm. It looked less like a holiday arrival and more like a raid. I saw the neighbors across the street, the owners of a pharmaceutical chain, peeking through their silk curtains. I saw the glow of smartphones being held up in the windows of the house next door. The arrival was loud, public, and impossible to ignore. Margaret frowned, but it was a frown of intense concentration, not displeasure. She stood up, smoothing the front of her red velvet gown, her eyes darting around the room to ensure everything was visually perfect. "He is early," she announced, her voice trembling with a mixture of nerves and adrenaline. "Charles, fix your tie. It is crooked. Ethan, stand up straight. Everyone, please, let us make a path." Charles Whitfield, a man who usually commanded boardrooms with an iron fist, looked flushed. He tugged at his silk cravat, checking his reflection in the mirror above the sideboard. "Excellent," Charles whispered, though in the sudden hush of the room, it sounded like a shout. "He must have skipped the stop at the mayor's house to come here first. That speaks volumes. Volumes." "Get your phones ready," Margaret commanded the table, her voice sharp. I want this documented. I want the moment he shakes Charles's hand to be on every social media feed in Briarwood Hills within the hour. The guests scrambled. The tax attorney fumbled for his iPhone. Mrs. Vance applied a fresh coat of lipstick in 3 seconds flat. They were like actors taking their places on a stage, arranging themselves into a tableau of power and influence, desperate to be part of the frame. I remained seated for a moment longer, watching them. I watched Ethan check his hair. I watched Margaret practice her welcoming smile, adjusting it until it reached the perfect level of obsequious charm. Then, the heavy oak front doors swung open. The sound of the outside world rushed in, the low idle of heavy engines, the crackle of police radios, and the rapid-fire mechanical click of camera shutters. Governor Lucas Hart stepped across the threshold. He looked exactly as he did on television, perhaps even more imposing in person. He wore a long black wool coat over a dark suit, snow dusting his shoulders, but he did not come alone. Behind him flowed a stream of people, press photographers with massive lenses, a videographer with a shoulder-mounted camera, and his security detail, who scanned the room with professional paranoia. Margaret let out a small gasp of delight. She moved forward, gliding across the Persian rug with her arms extended wide, placing herself directly in the center of the entryway. She was the hostess, the gatekeeper, the queen welcoming a visiting king. "Governor Hart?" she exclaimed, her voice pitching high and sweet. "What an honor! Welcome to the Whitfield Resi—" She never finished the word. Governor Hart did not stop. He did not slow down to accept her embrace. He offered a tight, polite smile that did not reach his eyes, and he kept walking. He reached Charles, who had stepped forward with his hand extended, ready for the photo op. Hart shook Charles's hand. The contact lasted exactly 2 seconds. It was perfunctory. It was the handshake a politician gives to a donor he barely remembers. "Mr. Whitfield," Hart said, his voice deep and resonant. "Good to see you." And then, his eyes moved. He looked right over Charles's shoulder. He looked past Margaret, who was standing there with her arms still half raised, her smile faltering into a mask of confusion. The governor's gaze swept the room, ignoring the senator, ignoring the venture capitalists, ignoring the $1,000,000 chandelier. He was hunting. I stood near the Christmas tree, my hand resting lightly on my father's arm. I felt Dad trembling. He was rigid, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. Across the room, Sarah Jenkins, the chief of staff, caught my eye. She stood by the door, holding a clipboard. She gave me a single, imperceptible nod. Showtime. Governor Hart stepped into the center of the living room. The cameras followed him, a phalanx of lenses turning away from the Whitfields and focusing on the open space. The room fell into a silence so profound I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. "Good evening," Hart said. His voice was not the booming voice of a campaign speech. It was quieter, more intimate, yet it carried to every corner of the high-ceilinged room. "I apologize for the interruption to your dinner, but I am not here tonight for politics. I am not here to discuss policy or budgets." He paused. Margaret turned around slowly, her face pale. She looked at Charles, silently asking, "What is happening?" "I am here," Hart continued, "to settle a debt that is 20 years overdue." He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto the figure standing next to me. "I am looking for a man whose name very few of you know," Hart said, "but without whom I would not be standing here today. Mr. Calvin Ellison, are you here?" The name hung in the air like a physical object. Calvin Ellison. For a split second, nobody moved. The guests looked at each other, confused. Who? The repairman? The guy in the cheap suit? Then, slowly, every head turned. 20 pairs of eyes swiveled away from the governor and landed on my father. Dad stood there, clutching his linen napkin in his left hand as if it were a lifeline. He blinked, his face flushing a deep, painful red. He looked at me, panic in his eyes. I squeezed his arm harder, anchoring him. "I am here," Dad whispered. It was too quiet. "I am here," he said again, his voice cracking slightly but louder this time. Governor Hart's face transformed. The political mask dropped, replaced by an expression of genuine, profound warmth. He began to walk. He walked past Margaret. This was the moment that would be burned into my memory forever. Margaret was standing directly in his path, assuming she was still the protagonist of this scene. But as Hart moved toward my father, Margaret had to physically step aside to avoid being run over. She stumbled slightly in her high heels, pushed to the periphery of her own living room. Hart did not even glance at her. He walked straight up to my father. The cameras flashed. Pop, 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 a blinding staccato of light capturing the governor of the state standing inches away from a man who had spent his life fixing other people's broken machines. Hart extended his hand. "Mr. Ellison," Hart said softly, gripping my father's hand with both of his. "It is an honor. Finally, I have waited a long time to look you in the eye." Dad looked down at their joined hands, then up at the governor. "Governor Hart, you came." "I told you I would," Hart said. "It just took me a while to find the right address." Hart turned then, keeping one hand on my father's shoulder, and addressed the room. He looked at the stunned faces of the guests. He looked at the senator, who was staring with his mouth slightly open. He looked at Ethan, who had turned the color of ash. "Some of you might know how I started my career," Hart began, his voice commanding the room. "You know me as the prosecutor who took down the chemical giants. You know me as the man who cleaned up the Oakhaven district." He gestured to my father. "But what you do not know is that I was flying blind. We had no evidence. The company had buried the reports. They were going to get away with poisoning 300 families. Children were getting sick and nobody could prove why." Hart paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. Then a technician from inside the plant came to see me. He brought me handwritten logs. He brought me diagrams of the bypass pipes that he had drawn himself, at night, risking his job, his pension, and his safety. He handed me the smoking gun. I watched Margaret. Her mouth was a thin, bloodless line. She was staring at my father as if he had suddenly grown a second head. "That man," Hart said, tightening his grip on Dad's shoulder, "was Calvin Ellison. He asked for nothing. He refused to be named in the press because he didn't want the glory. He just wanted the poisoning to stop." Hart reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a wooden plaque with the state seal engraved in gold and a heavy cream-colored envelope. "For 20 years, this man has worked in the shadows," Hart said, his voice thickening with emotion. "While I stood on podiums and took the applause, he went back to work. He fixed your heaters. He repaired your cooling systems. He lived a quiet life of absolute integrity." Hart handed the plaque to my father. Dad took it, his hands shaking. I saw a tear trace a path down Dad's weathered cheek. "Calvin," Hart said, dropping the formal title. "My career in public service exists because you taught me that the truth is worth more than a paycheck. I owe you this state. And tonight, I wanted to make sure that everyone in this room, and everyone in this state, knows exactly who you are." The flashbulbs went off again, blinding and relentless. I looked at Liliana Wilkins in the mirror across the room. I looked at the fierce pride on my face. Then I looked at the Whitfields. Charles looked like he had been slapped. He was holding his wine glass, but he had forgotten to drink from it. Ethan was looking at his shoes, unable to lift his head. And Margaret? Margaret looked like a statue of herself that had begun to crack. She was standing on the edge of the circle, watching the media fawn over the man she had mocked 40 minutes ago. The narrative she had constructed, the perfect family, the superior class, the benevolent charity toward the poor in-law, had been shattered into a million pieces. Dad looked at the plaque. He ran his thumb over his name engraved in the wood. "Thank you," Dad whispered, his voice thick. I didn't think anyone remembered." "The state remembers," Hart said firmly. He turned to the cameras. "Make sure you get this shot." He ordered the press pool. "This is what a real hero looks like. No entourage, no money, just courage." The room remained silent, stunned into submission by the sheer weight of the truth. And in that silence, the hierarchy of the Whitfield house was not just rearranged, it was demolished. The silence that had gripped the room broke not with a roar, but with a single, tentative clap. It came from the senator. He was a man who knew which way the political wind was blowing, and right now, it was blowing a gale force directly behind my father. Once the senator started clapping, the rest of the room fell in line like dominoes. The applause swelled, growing louder and more frantic as the guests realized that clapping for Calvin Ellison was now the socially required action of the evening. I stood back, leaning against the doorframe of the dining room, watching the spectacle with a cold, detached fascination. It was a study in human hypocrisy. 10 minutes ago, Mr. Sterling had been sneering at my father's job. Now, he was pushing his way through the crowd, his hand extended, desperate to shake the hand that the governor was holding. "Incredible story, Calvin," Sterling boomed, his voice thick with false camaraderie. "Truly inspiring. We need more men like you in the industry." Dad looked at him, bewildered. He shook Sterling's hand because he was polite, not because he was fooled. "Thank you," Dad mumbled. "I was just doing my job." The press pool was in a frenzy. Flashbulbs popped in rapid succession, turning the living room into a strobe-lit theater. A young female reporter from Channel 5, sensing the angle of the night, turned her microphone toward Margaret. Margaret was standing near the fireplace. Her smile was fixed, a rigid rictus of teeth that looked painful to maintain. She was gripping her champagne flute so hard I expected the stem to shatter and slice her palm open. "Mrs. Whitfield?" the reporter asked, thrusting the microphone forward. "It must be incredibly moving to have the governor choose your home to honor Mr. Ellison. Your family must be so proud of his history." I watched Margaret's throat work as she swallowed a scream. She blinked rapidly. For a second, I thought she might snap. I thought she might scream. "He is a repairman. Get him out of my house." But Margaret was a socialite before she was a human being. Survival came first. "Yes," Margaret choked out, her voice sounding like it was being dragged over gravel. "Of course, we are immensely proud. Calvin he is a very special part of our extended family." "Did you know about his role in the Oakhaven case when he joined the family?" the reporter pressed. Margaret's eyes darted to me. I raised my glass to her in a silent toast. "Go on. Margaret, lie." We don't like to boast," Margaret said, improvising poorly. "We believe that true heroism is quiet, just like Calvin." "Beautiful," the reporter said, turning back to the governor. Governor Hart was still standing next to my father. He had an arm around Dad's shoulder, shielding him from the worst of the crowd's aggression. "Governor," another reporter shouted, "what is next for Mr. Ellison?" Hart looked down at Dad. "Whatever he wants," Hart said. "But tonight, I just want him to know that the state of this union is strong because of men like him. Not the men who sign the checks, but the men who check the pipes." Dad looked up at the governor. He was trembling, but he wasn't looking at the floor anymore. "I feel like I am dreaming," Dad said, his voice captured clearly by the boom mic overhead. "I didn't do it for this. I just didn't want the kids to get sick." "And that," Hart said, pointing a finger at the camera, "is exactly why we are here. Character is doing the right thing when nobody is watching, but tonight, we are all watching." As the photographers scrambled to get a shot of Dad holding the plaque, I felt a hand grip my upper arm. It was not a gentle grip. I turned to see Charles Whitfield. His face was a mottled red, his eyes bulging slightly. He steered me forcefully toward the alcove near the library, away from the cameras but close enough that I could still see the circus I had orchestrated. "What is this?" Charles hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You set this up. You orchestrated this whole charade without saying a word to us." I pulled my arm free from his grasp. I smoothed my dress. "I didn't think you would be interested, Charles," I said calmly. "After all, You never asked who my father really was. You only asked what he did for a living. Do not play games with me, Liliana, Charles spat. This is my house. These are my guests. You brought the governor here under false pretenses. You made us look like bystanders in our own home. You are bystanders, I corrected him. You have always been bystanders to the truth. You just buy your way into the conversation. Before Charles could respond, Margaret descended upon us. She had broken away from the reporter, and she looked like a woman whose entire worldview had been incinerated. You spiteful little girl, Margaret whispered, her voice venomous. She stepped into my personal space, the smell of her expensive perfume cloying and suffocating. You used this family. You used this party. You turned my Christmas Eve into a stage for your father. I didn't use the family, Margaret, I said, meeting her gaze with a level stare. I just stopped hiding. You told me to keep him in the background. You told me he would be an embarrassment. I simply decided to show you that you were wrong. People will think the governor came here for him, Margaret hissed, gesturing wildly toward the center of the room where Hart was laughing at something Dad said. They will think Charles is irrelevant. Do you know what this does to our standing? To our brand? It clarifies it, I said. It shows everyone that while you were buying influence, my father was earning it. Margaret gasped. She looked ready to strike me. Then Ethan appeared. My husband, the man who had promised to love and cherish me. He looked pale, shaken, and utterly pathetic. He stepped between his mother and me, holding his hands up. Stop it, Ethan said. Everyone, keep your voices down. The press is 10 feet away. He turned to me. I waited. I waited for him to say, You were right. My parents were awful to him. Thank you for defending him. Instead, Ethan looked at me with a mixture of exhaustion and disappointment. Liliana, he said softly, do you think maybe you went a little too far? You could have told us. We could have managed this differently. The words hit me harder than Margaret's insults. Too far. Too far? I repeated. Ethan, your mother wanted to rent him a tuxedo so he wouldn't look like a pauper. Your father treated him like the help, and you sat there and let them... I was trying to keep the peace, Ethan argued. But this is a nuclear bomb. You humiliated them. No, Ethan, I said, feeling the final thread of my attachment to him snap. I didn't humiliate them. The truth humiliated them. If the truth destroys their image, then their image was a lie. I looked at him, and I realized that he wasn't just afraid of his parents. He was one of them. He valued the smooth surface of the pond more than the depths beneath it. He stood on the side of comfort, and I stood on the side of fire. A woman walked past our little huddled group. Mrs. Vance. She stopped, holding a glass of wine, looking back and forth between Margaret and the governor. Margaret, Mrs. Vance said, her tone laced with a sharp, sugary curiosity. I am just baffled. You have known Calvin for years. Why did you never mention that he was the Harbor Glen hero? I mean, if he were my in-law, I would have had him leading the parade. Margaret's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. She stammered, Well, as I said, Calvin is very private. We respected his privacy. Really? Mrs. Vance raised an eyebrow. Because earlier, you made it sound like he was just a handyman you tolerated. It is almost as if you didn't know. She took a sip of her wine, her eyes dancing with malicious amusement. How embarrassing for you, darling, to have a diamond in your pocket and think it was a rock. Mrs. Vance walked away, leaving Margaret standing there, stripped naked in the middle of her own ballroom. I turned away from them. I was done. I had said what I needed to say. I walked back toward the center of the room. The governor was preparing to leave. The security team was clearing a path to the door. Hart stopped in front of Charles and Margaret, who had rushed back to say goodbye, desperate to salvage some scrap of dignity from the wreckage. Governor, Charles said, extending his hand again, thank you for stopping by. It was quite a surprise. Hart did not shake his hand this time. He kept his hands in his coat pockets. He looked at Charles, then at Margaret, with a gaze that was polite but devastatingly cold. "It was a necessary visit," Hart said. "Your home is beautiful, Mr. Whitfield." "Thank you," Charles said, puffing up slightly. "But," Hart continued, raising his voice just enough so that the lingering guests and the nearby reporters could hear every syllable, "a house is only as good as the people in it. If you ever need anything from my office, the door is open. But perhaps the thing you need most right now is to learn how to respect Mr. Ellison properly." The sentence hung in the air like a guillotine blade that had just dropped. Hart turned to my father. "Calvin, I will have my aide call you next week. We have a committee on environmental safety. I want you on the board." I am not a board member type, Governor," Dad stammered. "You are exactly the type," Hart smiled. "Good night, my friend." The governor walked out into the winter night. The cameras followed him. The police sirens chirped once, then faded as the motorcade pulled away. The front door closed. The silence that returned to the room was not the respectful silence of the arrival. It was the awkward, suffocating silence of a party that has gone horribly wrong. The music had stopped. The energy had been sucked out of the room, leaving only the stark, undeniable reality of what had just happened. The guests began to check their watches. "Oh, look at the time," Mr. Sterling announced loudly. "We really must be going. Wonderful evening, Margaret." "Yes, truly unique," another guest said, grabbing her coat. They filed out quickly, muttering to themselves, casting covert glances at my father. They didn't want to stay. The air in the house had become toxic with the stench of the Whitfields' shame. I walked over to Dad. He was standing by the tree, holding the wooden plaque against his chest like a shield. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were bright. He looked taller. "You okay?" I asked. "I think so," he said, letting out a long breath. "That was intense." "You did great," I said. I looked across the room. Margaret, Charles, and Ethan were standing by the fireplace. They looked like a painting of a family that had been left out in the rain, smeared, blurry, and ruining the frame. I took Dad's arm. "Come on, Dad," I said. "Let's get your coat. We are leaving." "Leaving?" Dad asked. "But dessert." "We don't need their dessert," I said. "We have had enough." I guided him toward the foyer, walking past my husband without a backward glance. The play was over, the curtain had fallen, and I was taking the star of the show home. The silence that descended upon the Whitfield residence after the heavy oak doors clicked shut was heavier than any silence I had ever experienced. It was not peace. It was the suffocating, dense vacuum left behind when a storm front passes, leaving wreckage in its wake. The cheerful Christmas jazz playlist was still looping softly from the hidden speakers. "It is the most wonderful time of the year," crooned Andy Williams. But in the context of the room, the lyrics sounded mocking, almost grotesque. The festive atmosphere had curdled into something sour and uncomfortable. The guests who remained, the ones who hadn't fled immediately in the wake of the governor, looked lost. They stood in small, awkward clusters, holding empty glasses, unsure of the social protocol for a dinner party that had just been publicly dissected by the most powerful man in the state. I watched as the dynamic shifted in real time. Mr. Sterling, the man who had asked my father if he fixed refrigerators, approached Dad near the coat rack. He didn't look arrogant anymore. He looked sheepish. "Mr. Ellison," Sterling said, clearing his throat. "I want to apologize. I had no idea about your history. If I had known—" "You didn't need to know my history to treat me with respect, Mr. Sterling," Dad said gently, but apology accepted. Another couple, friends of Margaret's from the club, walked past. They nodded at Dad with a newfound, wide-eyed deference. "Merry Christmas, Calvin," the woman said. "Truly remarkable." They were scrambling to rewrite their own memories, to pretend they hadn't been laughing along with Margaret 40 minutes ago. It was pathetic, but it was also a victory. Slowly, the room emptied. The hangers-on retrieved their furs and their cashmere scarves. muttering vague excuses about early morning flights and babysitters. They fled the scene of the crime because they realized they were accomplices. When the last guest had gone, leaving only the catering staff silently clearing plates in the background, the four of us were left alone in the vast, glittering ruin of the holiday. Margaret stood by the fireplace. She had not moved for 10 minutes. She waited until the front door locked for the final time before she turned to face us. The mask of the gracious hostess was gone. In its place was a raw, trembling fury that distorted her features. "I hope you are happy," Margaret said, her voice low and shaking. "You two have just humiliated this entire family. You made us a laughingstock in front of the press, the senator, and our closest friends." I stepped forward, placing myself between her and my father. "Humiliated?" I asked, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. "Did we humiliate you, Margaret? Or did the truth just make you look small? Because the only thing that happened tonight was that the truth stopped waiting at the back door and walked right into your living room." "You ambushed us!" Charles shouted. Finally finding his voice, he slammed his hand down on the sidebar, making the crystal decanters rattle. "You brought a circus into my home. You made it look like we were ignorant. Do you have any idea how much business I do based on reputation? People will think I am out of touch." "You are out of touch. Charles," I snapped back, "you have been out of touch for 20 years. You thought my father was a prop. You thought his value was determined by his suit. The governor just reminded you that value is determined by what a man does when the lights are off." Charles turned to Ethan, his face purple with rage. "Speak to your wife. Ethan, tell her what she has done. Tell her she has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed." I looked at my husband. Ethan looked exhausted. He was slumped in one of the wingback chairs, rubbing his temples. He looked like a man who had been trying to hold up a collapsing tent and had finally let go of the poles. He looked up at me. His eyes were sad, pleading. "Liliana," he said, letting out a long, ragged sigh. I just wish you had told me. We could have handled this differently. We could have done the reveal without the surprise attack. We could have made it less dramatic." I felt a coldness settle in my chest, even now, after everything. He was critiquing my method rather than addressing the cause. "Dramatic?" I repeated the word slowly. "Ethan, do you know what is dramatic? Watching your father count pennies to buy LED lights so he can pay for your wedding flowers? Watching him be mocked by your mother for 3 years and having to swallow it because he loves his daughter too much to cause a scene? That is drama. That is pain. Tonight wasn't drama. Tonight was justice." "It was cruel," Margaret interjected, stepping forward. "It was calculated cruelty." "It was a mirror," I said. "If you don't like what you saw in it, don't blame the glass." The room fell silent again. The air was thick enough to choke on. Then, a voice spoke up from behind me. It was not loud, but it carried a weight that it had lacked before. "If what my daughter did tonight makes you feel ashamed," Dad said, stepping up beside me, "then perhaps the problem isn't with her." Margaret blinked. She looked at my father, really looked at him, for the first time. She saw the plaque in his hand. She saw the new suit. She saw the man who had the governor's personal cell phone number. And because Margaret was a creature of survival, a woman who knew how to pivot when the wind changed, I saw the gears in her head turn. Her expression softened. The rage was replaced by a calculating, slippery charm. "Well," Margaret said, forcing a tight smile, Perhaps we are all a bit overwrought. It has been a long night." She smoothed her dress. And honestly, when you think about it, this could be a good thing, a very good thing. We have the spring gala coming up for the foundation. We could use this story. The unsung hero of Harbor Glen. It plays very well with the working-class demographic we are trying to court. We could have Calvin give a speech. Charles, imagine the press coverage if we framed it as a Whitfield family legacy of service. I stared at her in disbelief. It was breathtaking. She was already trying to package my father's integrity and sell it to buy back her own reputation. I laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that cut through her scheming. "No," I said. Margaret's smile faltered. Excuse me? No, I repeated. That is not happening. That is exactly what I wanted to make clear tonight. My father is not a prop. He is not a token. He is not a heartwarming anecdote you can pull out at galas to make yourself look benevolent. I took a step closer to her. From this moment on, I said, if Calvin Ellison walks into this house, he walks in as a guest of honor. He walks in as the man the governor respects. He does not walk in to be your charity case or your political tool. And if you cannot respect that, then neither of us will ever walk through that door again. I turned to Ethan. This was the moment, the pivot point of our marriage. I need to know where you stand. Ethan, I said, and do not tell me you are in the middle. The middle does not exist anymore. You are either with me and my father, or you are with the comfortable silence of this house. Which is it? Ethan looked at his mother, who was glaring at him with expectation. He looked at his father, who was fuming. Then he looked at me, and at my dad standing tall in his blue suit. He stood up. He walked over to us. He didn't take my hand, but he stood on our side of the Persian rug. I am with you, Liliana, Ethan said. His voice was quiet, but firm. Margaret gasped. Ethan, you are choosing this over your family? They are my family. Mom, Ethan said. He looked at me, his expression pained but honest. I am with you, but Liliana, I am going to need time. I have lived in this house my whole life, unlearning this, unlearning how they think. It isn't going to happen overnight. I need time to step out of their shadow. I looked at him. I didn't see a knight in shining armor. I saw a flawed man trying to be better, and that was real enough for now. Time is fine, I said softly. We have time, but the boundaries start tonight, right now. Agreed, Ethan said. I nodded. I turned to Dad. Let's go. Dad, the car is warm. You are leaving? Charles asked, stunned. It is Christmas Eve. We have our own tradition, I said. We are going to go home, turn on the old lights, and drink hot cocoa. We are going to be warm, and that is all we need. I took Dad's hand. We walked toward the door. The catering staff watched us go, and I saw one of the older servers give Dad a subtle thumbs up. We stepped out into the night. The air was biting cold, clean and sharp. Snow had started to fall in earnest. Large, soft flakes that muffled the sound of the world. The police barricades were gone. The cameras were gone. It was just the silence of winter and the crunch of snow under our boots. I stopped at the car and looked back at the house. Through the massive bay window, I could see the scene inside like a lit stage. Margaret was shouting at Charles. Charles was pouring himself a drink with shaking hands. Ethan was standing apart from them, looking out the window at us, his hand pressed against the glass. They were in the same room, but they were miles apart. The perfect portrait of the Whitfield family had cracked down the middle, and no amount of money could glue it back together. Dad stood beside me, looking at the mansion. He adjusted his coat. You know, he said softly, his breath pluming in the cold air. I was terrified in there. My knees were knocking together. You didn't show it, I said. He looked at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. There was a look in them I hadn't seen before, a mixture of awe and fierce, overwhelming pride. You did the one thing I never dared to do. Lily, he said, you forced them to look at me. You made them see me. I didn't make them see you. Dad, I said, opening the car door for him. I just wiped the steam off the glass. You were always there. I just put you back in your rightful place in the story. And what about them? Dad asked, nodding toward the house. What happens to them? That is up to them, I said. They can learn, or they can be lonely, but that is not our job anymore. I got into the driver's seat and started the engine. The heater kicked on, blasting warm air. Dad loosened his tie, the old red tie with the frayed edges, and leaned back with a contented sigh. As we drove down the long, winding driveway, the iron gates of the estate began to close slowly behind us. I watched in the rearview mirror as the lights of the mansion grew smaller and smaller, until they were just distant pinpricks in the darkness. Ahead of us, the lights of Ridgemont twinkled in the valley. Chaotic and bright and alive, we were driving back to the real world, back to the small house with the drafty windows and the heart of gold. I drove toward the city lights, knowing that a new chapter had begun. It wasn't a chapter built on compromise or silence. It was built on the night I finally stood tall for the only man who had never let me down. And for the first time in years, I felt completely, utterly free. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today, so please drop a comment below and share your location. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed seeing Liliana stand up for her dad, please consider subscribing to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, hitting that like button, and pressing the hype button to help this video get discovered by more people. Your support means the world to us. See you in the next story.